When you think of classic muscle cars, you probably imagine big engines and even bigger power. But the 1970s were different. That's what we call the slump era, when muscle cars nearly went extinct. They still had those big engines, sure, but they barely coughed up any power. A 5-liter V8? Back then, it might only put out 140 horsepower. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what went wrong and why these power figures seem to be cut in half. The 1960s were the golden age of American muscle cars, a time when these powerful machines captured the imagination of a generation. The Mustang, Camaro, Chevelle SS, and Pontiac GTO weren't just cars. They were symbols of freedom, style, and raw performance. Under the hood, these muscle cars packed big V8 engines, often ranging from 5.7 liters all the way up to a colossal 7.4 liters. The legendary 426 Hemi from Chrysler was officially rated at 425 horsepower. The Chevrolet 454 LS6 made 450 horsepower, and the Ford 429 Cobra Jet produced around 375 horsepower. And remember, those power figures were considered absolutely mind-blowing in their time. Seeing a car with 400 horsepower in the 1960s was like seeing a hypercar on the street today. These engines used high compression ratios, typically between 10:1 and 11:1, which meant they squeezed the air-fuel mixture extra hard, producing more power with every explosion in the cylinders. Fuel delivery was handled by simple but effective carburetors. These fed the thirsty engines a rich mixture to maximize performance. The tuning prioritized outright power and torque, rather than fuel economy or emissions. Muscle cars often boasted horsepower numbers from 350 up to over 450. But these figures were measured using what's called gross horsepower. That means the engine was tested on a stand, without all the accessories, exhaust restrictions, or real-world limitations. So, the numbers were often higher than what you experienced on the road. Despite this, these cars felt fast and furious. The combination of raw torque and that unmistakable V8 roar created a thrilling experience. For drivers in the 1960s, muscle cars ruled the road, faster, louder, and more exciting than nearly anything else on the streets. But as the 1970s rolled in, the glory days of muscle cars were about to face their biggest challenges yet. As the 1970s dawned, the muscle car dream faced a turning point. Not because the cars themselves changed overnight, but because the world around them did. The Clean Air Act of 1970 was born out of growing concern over the thick smog blanketing American cities. Urban skies were choking, and scientists had linked vehicle emissions to serious health problems. The government realized something had to change, and fast. This landmark law introduced the first nationwide emissions regulations for cars, targeting hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides. The goal was ambitious: cut these pollutants by nearly 90% in just a few years. The newly created Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was now in charge, and automakers had no choice but to comply. The problem? The technology to keep engines clean without killing performance simply didn't exist yet. The fastest solution was to detune the massive V8 engines that muscle cars were known for. Compression ratios plummeted, dropping from 10:1 or 11:1 down to 8:1 or lower. Lower compression meant the engine didn't squeeze the air-fuel mixture as hard, and that directly killed horsepower. Ignition timing had to be softened to prevent engine knock, and catalytic converters arrived, adding back pressure to the exhaust. Combine that with the switch to unleaded gasoline, and the roaring V8 engines of the 1960s suddenly felt muffled and restrained. By 1971, the writing was on the wall. Muscle cars still looked the part, and the engines were still huge, but the soul-shaking power of the previous decade was gone. Horsepower ratings dropped fast, and the golden era of muscle was starting to fade. And just as emissions regulations changed the game, an even bigger storm was about to hit: the oil crisis. If emissions regulations had started the decline of muscle cars, the 1973 oil crisis came in and hit the final nail. It all started in the fall of 1973, during the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. Several Arab nations were at war with Israel, and the United States openly supported Israel with weapons and supplies. In retaliation, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, cut oil exports to the U.S. Overnight, gasoline prices skyrocketed, and in some areas, gas stations completely ran out of fuel.
Just one question I'd like to ask you. How many miles to the gallon does it do?
This car will get somewhere between 6 to 8 miles per gallon.
6 miles a gallon? But where am I going to get the gas from?
Drivers faced long, frustrating lines, and the era of cheap, endless gas, the very thing that made muscle cars possible, was suddenly over. For cars that drank fuel at 8 miles per gallon, this was devastating. Muscle cars went from being a symbol of freedom to a financial nightmare. And as if that wasn't enough, insurance companies started cracking down on high-horsepower cars at the same time. Premiums for muscle cars spiked to insane levels, making them nearly impossible for young enthusiasts to afford. Faced with rising gas prices, stricter emissions rules, and crippling insurance costs, buyers abandoned muscle cars almost overnight. Automakers responded by detuning engines even further and shifting their focus toward comfort and fuel economy, leaving behind the raw power that defined the 1960s. By the mid-1970s, the muscle car era was a shadow of its former self. The cars still looked the part, but under the hood the performance was fading fast, and the true heartbreak was still to come. If you were a car fan in the early 1970s, the falling horsepower numbers were shocking. One year, a car like the Chevy Chevelle SS claimed 450 horsepower. The next year, the same car showed 275 horsepower. It almost looked like the engines had been cut in half overnight. But here's the twist. Not all of that drop was real. Before 1972, carmakers used something called gross horsepower. This was the power an engine made on a test stand, with no accessories, no exhaust, no air filter. Basically perfect lab conditions. The numbers looked incredible but didn't reflect what you actually felt on the street. Starting in 1972, manufacturers switched to net horsepower, which measured power with full exhaust, air filters, and all accessories running, a far more realistic number. So, while emissions and detuning definitely hurt performance, the new rating system also made engines look weaker on paper than they actually were. The combination of real detuning and new math created the perception that muscle cars had completely fallen off a cliff. And for buyers, it didn't matter if the drop was real or just on paper. The muscle car mystique was fading fast. Big engines, embarrassing numbers. By the mid-1970s, muscle cars were still huge on the outside, but under the hood, they were a shadow of their former selves. The engines were still big V8 power plants, 5.0 liters, 5.7 liters, even 7.5 liters in some full-size cars. But the horsepower? Embarrassing. Take the 1975 Chevrolet Camaro with its 5.7-liter V8. On paper, that sounds like it should shred tires and scare the neighbors. In reality, it made just 145 horsepower. Or the 1976 Ford Thunderbird, a massive 5.8-liter V8 pushing 152 horsepower. It was hard to swallow for any muscle car fan watching those numbers drop so low. Even the Corvette, the true American sports car icon, wasn't spared. The 1975 Corvette's 5.7-liter V8 made just 165 horsepower. For a car that looked the part and growled like a beast, the lack of power was a punch to the gut. Imagine that. A street monster in looks but with muscle that barely flexed. It wasn't just sad, it was downright heartbreaking. These cars still looked mean, still roared when you floored it. But the soul-shaking rush, the brutal acceleration of the golden years, was gone. 0 to 60 times crept painfully slow, wiping away the thrill that once defined the muscle car spirit. The muscle car era had gone from roaring dominance to quiet disappointment, and true enthusiasts could only watch in disbelief and frustration. The 1970s may have been a dark chapter, but muscle cars weren't gone for good. They were just catching their breath. The downfall came from three walls closing in: gas shortages from the OPEC oil crisis, sky-high insurance premiums for performance cars, and strict emissions regulations that strangled power. But here's the thing. Most of these conditions didn't just disappear. The oil crisis ended by the late 1970s, and gas prices stabilized. Insurance rates calmed down too, as the high-risk youth market faded and muscle cars became more of an enthusiast niche. Emissions regulations, though, they never went away. Instead, technology evolved to meet the challenge. In the 1980s and 90s, electronic fuel injection, better catalytic converters, and smarter ignition systems allowed V8s to make more power without breaking emissions laws. Cars like the Fox-body Mustang and the fourth-generation Camaro Z28 brought horsepower back into the 200 to 300 horsepower range, a flicker of life after the slump. Then came the modern muscle era in the 2000s and 2010s. Advanced tech, superchargers, computer tuning, and direct injection allowed cars to explode past 600 and even 700 horsepower, all while passing emissions tests and getting double the gas mileage of those 1960s beasts. The muscle car didn't survive because the rules disappeared. It survived because technology caught up, turning the restrictions of the 1970s into challenges that modern engineering crushed. From the ashes of the 70s, the muscle car didn't just come back. It came back smarter, cleaner, and more powerful than ever. And that's the story of how American muscle cars went from legends to jokes, and back to legends again. It's crazy to think the same country that once gave us 145 horsepower V8s now sells 760 horsepower monsters that still pass emissions. The muscle car survived the oil crisis, insurance crackdowns, and strict emissions laws, not because the rules went away, but because engineering fought back and won. So now, I want to hear from you. Do you think today's muscle cars still capture the soul of the classics? Or has modern technology made them too polished to be true muscle? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into automotive history, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another story like this.